Hi there guys, and welcome to another Scooby Doo tier list. This time I'm covering What's New Scooby Doo. I definitely have a soft spot for this show. Coming in the early 2000s, it was my peak early childhood years, so I watched a lot of this show growing up, and it very much is like the old Scooby Doo format, reinvented to fit into the early 2000s, with of course updated animation and all that kind of stuff. So I am interested to discuss all these monsters for you today. As ever, if you want to show the channel some love, feel free to do so by liking and subscribing. But for now, I'm just going to get into this. The first episode was There's No Creature Like Snow Creature. And surprisingly enough, the Snow Creature was the monster from the episode. And he's definitely very good. Is he godly? In the context of the show, I think he is, I think they put him to good use in the episode. I mean, he's clearly big, and he's capable of causing avalanches and things like that. So he's not to be trifled with. He does actually injure the gang at one point, doesn't he? I think it's Fred, is it, who gets a broken leg? And the episode is great in general. There's a lot of suspense to it, a decent mystery. The culprit is Avalanche Anderson, who wants to injure the other competitors so that he could win the skiing race and become famous again. So yeah, the whole thing as a package comes together very well. And although he's a robot controlled by Avalanche Anderson, the creature still has a lot of presence, and is one of the more dangerous foes they face. So yeah, a very good start to the series, as far as the monsters go. Next up is a dinosaur spirit, from 3D Destruction, and it was only okay. It's another robot type monster. There was actually an excavator, used to smuggle gold from the mine, under the museum the gang were at. That's the story. And they created the spirit of this dinosaur to scare people away. I do think that in general it's just a run-of-the-mill dinosaur. Sure, it chases a gang about, and by nature it has a presence, but it's not memorable. I didn't like the episode as much. So yeah, I think it's okay, it's not bad. But whenever I see like a vanilla design like this, I always struggle to call it good. Next up is the Space Ape, from Space Ape at the Cape. This guy again was decent to good. My first instinct was okay, but thinking about it, it might be good, because there are several versions of him. There's like a small version of him, and it supposedly could keep growing in size, as it had different people in the suit. So it was quite interesting how Janet, who was the culprit, put that together. I wouldn't say he's the most, fearsome monster ever, even just by his appearance, but, as I said, the fact that he kept changing the scale of himself is a pretty good niche by itself. And whenever a monster has like a creative niche, I always want to give it some extra props for that. But it's not one of the episodes which sticks in my mind the most, I have to say. Next up are the Leland brothers. And they're godly for sure. I mean, just look at them, they have a very creepy appearance, with their glowing red eyes, and they're always about in fog and that kind of thing. There's a good chase scene in that episode, on the water slides and all sorts. And in general, the episode has a very good atmosphere. One of the more creepy episodes from this particular show, I think. And in general, the premise of a Civil War reenactment is quite novel for Scooby Doo by itself. So in that sense, they do have a good story behind them. Yeah, I just have to give these two a lot of credit. Because on paper, they don't look to be that special. But you take one look at them, and you instantly know that they're from What's New Scooby Doo. And in that sense, you could argue that they're one of the more standout monsters from the series. So no doubt they're top tier for me. Next up is the Mystery Machine itself, from It's a Mean Green Mystery Machine. And I really struggle to know where to put this one. On one hand, it's a good concept to supposedly have the Mystery Machine turn evil against the gang. But on the other hand, it is just this van that's trying to run them over. So I'm gonna put it in okay. I think it's kind of a Marmite thing. Some people would probably love it, some people would hate it, and I can see both sides of the argument. They do make good use of its green lighting to provide some good effects, where the van kind of eyes up the gang. The revelation that it was all under control was kind of predictable, so yeah, I struggle with it, so I'm just going to put it in okay. Next up is the ghost of Rufus, from Riva Ras Vegas, and he's good I think. I like him better than probably most people would. He is a magician after all, so he does have quite a few certain tricks up his sleeve. The episode in general is quite good. One thing I remember vividly from it is that it has this pop singer who's singing all these kind of cheesy pop songs, and a gang get up on stage dancing to them. Nothing to do with the villain, but again, if a villain is in a memorable episode, that does help it out a little bit. Now, the actual culprit being Rufus's assistant was kind of underwhelming. I almost would have preferred it to be Rufus himself, but it is what it is. The monster still worked well in the concept of the episode, so I have to give it good. Next up is the roller coaster from Roller Coaster Ride. On one hand it is okay, but at the same time I really don't like the culprit and the motive, so I'm going to put it in the bottom tier. The whole concept is that the monster is going around sabotaging these theme park rides. And there are two sisters that run this park, and Terry, one of her sisters, the one who is presented as the good girl in the episode, is the culprit, and her more rebellious sister is the innocent one. But it made no sense at all the way it was presented. Apparently, it was all perfectly safe, and Terry wasn't actually putting the gang in any harm, but if you watch the episode, she was literally disconnecting wires and having the rides fling off in all directions. You're not going to tell me that there was no harm in that. It was just nonsensical, really. I mean, I know this is a show for kids, but even as a kid, that ending always kind of left me bewildered. So that kind of left a sour taste about the whole episode in my opinion, and especially the monster, so yeah, has to be trash, for that trashy ending alone. Next up is the Jungle Demons, from the Safari episode, and they're okay for me. They're just glowing animals at the end of the day, and you could argue that when you've got like a lion chasing after you, that there's some intimidation factor there. But it wasn't as impactful for me as it probably should be. I remember bits and bobs about the episode, but it's not the best one in my opinion. And ultimately, they're not memorable, are they? You wouldn't think of these monsters, these animals, and think, oh yeah, those are classic Scooby Doo monsters. I mean, it just wouldn't happen, would it? So for that reason, they're the definition of average. Next up is a giant sea serpent, which again ended up being a robot, and again is an average. It's meant to protect this tiny island the gang goes to visit, but it never did anything which stood out to me. At least the culprit was actually doing it for a good reason, which is a bit of a twist. Crunchy, yeah, the guy's name's actually Crunchy, was trying to scare people off to protect the local wildlife. So in that sense it was interesting, but an interesting motive does not necessarily make the monster good, and that's certainly the case here. Next up is the Headless Snowman, from a Scooby Doo Christmas, and he's godly for me. On paper it's just a snowman, but he's a lot more iconic than that I think. His detachable head that he can like roll about. It's kind of funny but also kind of creepy. I enjoy the episode, very much so. The professor as a villain was also interesting, and again it's a great chase scene. It's the one that goes, Santa Claus, one gift's enough for all of us. Yeah, that one. Yeah, it's a good episode. Probably the best Christmas-themed Scooby-Doo episode. Not like there's much competition, but still, I've always liked him as a villain. Next up are the toys, from Toy Scary Boo. Again, kinda like the Mystery Machine, it's an interesting concept, but I'm not entirely sure I love them. It's either top of okay or bottom of good. I'll go bottom of good, because the villain, Walter Claphammer, who was the security guard at the toy store, was one of the more interesting villains. He programmed all these toys to scare people and be kind of a distraction to the fact that he was robbing paintings across the road, which is kind of mental if you think about it. Makes no sense, but it's almost weird enough that I can get behind it. So yeah, I'm not going to claim that this was like amazing, but when you combine that interesting villain with the weird sight of all these toys ganging up on the gang, it's enough to hold my interest and make it a worthwhile episode. So for that reason, the toys are going in good. Next up is the Faceless Phantom, from Lights, Camera, Mayhem, and he's okay. These Faceless Phantoms are a dime a dozen in Scooby Doo, and there have been many better ones in previous shows. The culprit was someone working on the movie who didn't want to work on the movie and tried to like get it cancelled because he thought the movie was so bad, which is kind of funny I guess, but it's not memorable at all. The villain is kind of, well, look at him, he's a bit generic, isn't he, a bit bland, so he can do no better than okay for me. Next up is a zombie gladiator from Pompeii and Circumstance. Another generic-ish design. He's meant to be this ghost, but he behaves more like a generic gladiator, fighting people who dare intrude on a coliseum. The scheme was like a land development. They wanted to scare people away so they could develop land. It's just average, like every way you look at it. Any way you slice it, it's generic. Sorry about that, what can I say? Next up is the Baseball Spectre, And on paper he looks nothing special, but he works for me. He's probably top of good, I'd say. I like the episode, the way he throws baseballs at people and chases them around a baseball stadium. There's a lot of intrigue there. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a sports fan, but whenever Scooby Doo has sports-related villains, they tend to do it well, I think, and this guy is no exception. There'll be a few more like that later on in the list. Next up is the 30-foot Shaggy from Big Appetite in Little Tokyo. On one hand, he is a 30-foot Shaggy, so I guess there's some intrigue there and intimidation there, so that kind of makes you want to put him in good. But on the other hand, it is just another big monster. It does go around smashing a few things up, but it actually doesn't cause as much destruction as you'd think. It's just kind of there, to be honest. The villain was called Professor Pomfret, who was annoyed that, in his words, he was just an underpaid high school teacher, which is kind of lame, let's be real. So I kind of want to put him in okay, actually. Kind of on the level of these two. Could have been better, I think. The concept that Shaggy thought he was turning into a monster could have been used better. They definitely could have made more out of this than they actually did. Next up is the Pharaoh Mummy, and I like him. He's either good or godly. I think he's godly, to be honest. He's a great villain, but the episode is great too. There's a lot going on. The gang are in this pyramid at one point, which is kind of creepy. He definitely has a good design, a creepy look to him. More so than most mummies that appear on Scooby Doo. There's this kind of weird song that goes on, which kind of hypnotizes people as well, for a brief time. That's very creepy stuff. One thing I remember particularly from the episode is that they have Melbourne O'Reilly there, who is like Fred's hero, and he's totally like a parody of Steve Irwin, but he's a great character, I thought. Definitely a standout recurring character from What's New Scooby Doo. So yeah, everything kind of lines up well for this guy. I definitely enjoyed him as a villain. Next up is, well, the Fast and the Wormiest, and the worm is called Gusano Grande. And this giant worm is absolutely not godly, it's trash, it's trash. The episode is not well liked by fans, and I don't particularly like it either. The idea that they get into a race across the desert isn't bad, but again, it's just another giant monster. And this show, as you can probably guess by now, doesn't handle the giant monsters particularly great. They end up just being mechanical robots, who don't actually accomplish much, and they all end up feeling very samey, and Gibby Norton is the villain. And I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of Gibby Norton as a recurring character. Obviously he's this nerdy type of guy, who has a crush on Velma, but he's just annoying, with his nasally voice and all that kind of stuff. Not for me at all. And there's this weird kind of cult in the episode as well, which worships this worm, which is odd, to say the least. Yeah, just get out of here, it doesn't do anything for me, this. Next up is the House of the Future, from the High-Tech House of Horrors. And although the house itself was the villain, the picture here is of one of the robots inside the house. But I'm gonna put it in good. I just think it was interesting, right? Having the house itself be the villain. Maybe some warnings there of technology, and how it could be programmed to work against us. Maybe foreshadowing some AI problems, perhaps, in the future. In general, I thought it was an interesting episode, right? I said earlier I like unique concepts, and this was definitely a unique concept. So the episode gets bonus points for that. That's all I can say about it, really. When the villain is a house, it did about the best it could. Next up is, well, just the vampire from The Vampire Strikes Back. And this guy, for me, is trash. There have been a few vampires on Scooby Doo, but as far as vampires go, this guy is about as generic as you can possibly get. At least the episode has the Hex Girls in, but that's about the only thing to be said for it. The villain itself, and the motive behind it, is all mediocre. I mean, does this guy look convincing to you? He looks like a joke to me. I mean, if I saw this guy coming at me, I would be a bit like, what is going on, but he wouldn't like strike fear into you, would he? He's not that intimidating. So I'm sorry, I just don't buy this guy. He's trash, I'm afraid. Next up are the Scarecrow robots, from a Scooby Doo Halloween. They're okay to good, they're good I think, just about. They serve their purpose in the episode. There's actually a villain missing from that same episode, which was actually just like a holographic projection, which was called the Ghost of Anchor Manning. And he was decent as well, for the brief time he showed up. I quite like the episode, so that helps these villains out, despite just being generic robots. And there's a Kiss song in this episode as well, so you can't go wrong with that, can you? Next up is the cat creature from Homeward Hound. It's not as good as the cat creature from the Scooby Doo show in my opinion, but it's still top end of okay. It is quite interesting how it's like terrifying the dogs at the dog show, and it does actually interact with Shaggy and Scooby quite a lot, the villain does. The reason it does that is because the culprit is actually Shaggy's friend, Meadow, who is trying to kidnap the Secret Six puppies. They're recurring characters, by the way, if you didn't know. But ultimately, she wanted her dog to win a dog contest. That's why she did it. It's an okay episode. The villain is okay. But again, it doesn't particularly stand out. That's what's holding it back from being good. Next up is the San Fran Psycho, from the episode of the same name. And this guy is godly. He's certainly up there at the top, competing with these two. You know what, I'm going to put him at the very top, I think. I love the episode. It's a very good setting at this skate tournament in like the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge. The story behind him is great. He's supposedly a former Alcatraz inmate that tried to escape and like drown at sea, which is quite dark if you think about it. And the culprit itself is kind of funny. It's one of the judges, one of the female judges, who claimed she couldn't get into the competition because she was a girl, but in reality it wasn't because she was a girl, it's because she was just bad as a skateboarder, which is kind of funny, isn't it, to say the least. But yeah, it's great. The chase scene in the episode is great. The bit where they visit Alcatraz and he kind of hunts them down on the island. His design gets the job done. I wouldn't say it's the best design in the world, but it's still good. But when you combine everything the episode has to offer, with the backstory of the villain and the culprit's backstory, it's all high quality stuff, I have to say. Certainly a contender for the best villain of the whole show. Next up is the Scooby Snack Monster, from Recipe for Disaster. I think it's good, probably middle of good. The gang actually visiting a Scooby Snack factory. The supposed backstory behind this guy was that there was a former employee who died in Scooby Snack paste, and now has returned as a ghost, and is lurking around the factory. Which is kind of a horrifying death, isn't it? Dying in Scooby Snack batter. As I said, the episode is quite good. There's this whole backstory of spies at the factory running throughout the whole thing, and the culprit ended up being Penelope Bailey, who was the daughter of Ernest Bailey, who actually owned the factory. And she's another villain who kind of got away with it, because supposedly she only put on the monster costume to protect the place from spies, which was kind of interesting, but at the same time, why do you need to go around scaring the gang if you're doing that? Doesn't make that much sense. But again, the monster itself has an interesting design. The episode is fine, it's better than average, so I have to say that the monster is better than average as well. Next up is the episode Large Dragon at Large, another remote control operated big guy. But at least it had a twist. It had kind of two forms. One had wings and was like a Waven. I guess I put it top of okay again. As far as these type of monsters go, it was one of the better ones. As being a dragon, it did have some unique feats, but the culprit wasn't that interesting. It was just some guy trying to find the treasure of the castle. And the episode doesn't stand out. It also reuses a roar, which the dinosaur spirit also had. So that's an interesting fact about this. Next up is the Invisible Madman. And I think this is another kind of guy where you either love him or hate him. I think he's on the good side, to be honest. I like the episode. Some people might hate him or diss on him for being invisible. I'm sure it saved some on the animation budget in the episode. But in all seriousness, I thought it was interesting, an interesting dynamic to have this invisible guy. It's not like they didn't do anything with it. You could still see the effects of what he was doing, even if you couldn't see him itself. I quite like the episode too, the fact that Simple Plan are there. The chase song is good. One of the better chase songs. Not surprising that it is done by Simple Plan. The ending bit as well, I think is good, where he kind of gets stuck in this electric field, and that's what leads to his downfall. So yeah, once again, there's probably a variety of different opinions on this guy, but I'm definitely more in the positive camp. Next up is the Fish Creature, from Uncle Scooby and Antarctica. He's either top of good or bottom of godly. Tough one, but you know what, I really like the episode, so I am just gonna squeeze him into godly. I mentioned in my Scooby Doo show tier list that I always like kind of aquatic fish type monsters. It allows them to explore a different setting. The sea is always creepy, isn't it, by itself? And some of the scenes where he tries to drag Scooby under the frozen ice and water It's quite creepy stuff, dangerous stuff as well. The villain was the cowardly assistant of the Doctor. He's kind of an annoying character, and again he has supposedly a decent moral of not wanting people to interfere with the scientific experiments going on, but ignoring the culprit himself. The villain works well. I like the episode. Scooby Doo kind of makes friends with this penguin along the way. That's a standout moment for me from it. So yeah, maybe a bit of personal bias, but he goes in top tier for me. Next up is Wakumi, I think is how you say it, from the episode Old Mexico, New Monster. And it's essentially just this giant bird, like a rip-off of the Willow from the Scooby Doo show. It's not as good though, it's okay at best. Another one of these big monsters. It's supposedly wild and fierce, and tries to swoop down and carry people off in its talons. The culprit is this guy who's mechanically operating in it from within inside the creation itself, which is kinda weird. I just didn't find the backstory or the episode particularly engaging. Probably below par if I have to say all round. Next up is the Centaur, from It's All Greek to Scooby Doo. The episode is average, but the monster's okay. I've always quite liked centaurs. Centaurs in mythology have always interested me. I wouldn't say he's that unique as a villain, but he gets the job done, he's okay. Don't really have a lot else to add to him. If you have any more vivid memories of him, please let me know. Next up is the Creepy Keeper, from Fright House of a Lighthouse. And this is going straight to the top. It's very similar to the San Fran Psycho, I'd say. I actually don't know which one I want to put higher. I think I'll put the Lighthouse Keeper just higher. It's another monster that has a great dark backstory. There was supposedly this old lighthouse keeper who turned off the lights of the lighthouse to sink the ship so that he could claim the cargo for himself. But he ended up getting hit by a tree branch through the window and sent him plummeting to his death to the bottom of the lighthouse. Just like the San Fran Psycho, a very dark backstory. And just like the San Fran Psycho, the culprit was interesting. It was Verona Dempsey, who was Velma's villain throughout the episode, a very smart woman, who claims to be trying to solve the case, but is actually the culprit all along. And her motive was to create a monopoly, basically, of the ships coming in and out of the region. But yeah, it's a great episode, very interesting. Another great chase song. I think his design slightly edges out the San Fran Psycho as well, which is why I put him slightly ahead. But again, I keep reiterating, these two are very similar, I have to say. You could flip them around, and I wouldn't have a problem with it. Next up is a robot, Cold Steel, from Go West, Young Scoob. I mean, he's okay at best, probably lower end of okay, I have to say. The episode is fine, but they do get a bit mixed up at points about who is a robot and who isn't. Some of that doesn't make much sense, and again, Gibby Norton is one of the people behind it, so that's a strike against him by itself. The whole concept of robots going haywire, I think was done better in the Future House episode, and there's nothing memorable about this particular episode either, so meh. Next up is the Clones of the Gang, from a Scooby Doo Valentine. I'm gonna put them in good, just about. It's kind of interesting seeing this evil version of the gang. I think it's slightly better than the evil version of the Mystery Machine, simply because they're actually seen doing stuff like ripping car doors off with their own bare hands, so they clearly have some strength and potential about them. Now, the villains weren't the best. Some of them are just hired actors, which is kind of odd, but the main one, JC, was kidnapping teenagers from Lover's Lane and putting the blame on the gang because he was jealous of Shaggy's girlfriend, Rachel. Which is just as odd as it sounds, but at least it worked well at providing some kind of entertainment in the episode. So yeah, there's just enough there. There's just enough meat on the bone for me to consider this a win. Next up is the Titanic twist. And again, a lot of people hate on this guy, but I quite liked him. Sure, the fact that he was made up of 2 children is a bit unbelievable, given some of the feats of strength that he does, and some of the moves that he pulls off. But hey, I quite like his design. His 2 arms on the same side. It's not at all practical, but it's interesting. And that's all I care about really from Scooby Doo. I quite like the episode. WrestleManiacs. Seeing all the different wrestlers was interesting. And I just found it entertaining for the most part, so I can forgive the kids being the villain. And of course they get away with it in the end. Next up is a gargoyle from Ready to Scare. The episode is good, I think. The villain actually turns out to be Bianca LeBlanc, who is Daphne's cousin, who is this model, who's only doing it because she wants to get away from the lifestyle of a model and live a quieter life. The gargoyle does some good stuff in the episode, flying around Paris. It certainly has some intimidation factor. And there's this weird guy who's like obsessed with it, who guards the Notre Dame Cathedral. So that side of things was interesting, spending some time in Notre Dame. Yeah, I think it's just good. I think that's a fair place to put it. Next up is a demon farmer from Farmed and Dangerous. It's a kind of humanoid looking monster, but I think it works well. I always remember the villain being Neville Poppenbacker, and the whole thing is about popcorn, because his brand of popcorn is crap, and essentially he wants to make a better brand. So he uses a demon farmer costume as a means to do that. It's a solid episode. Again, it's not the best, most creative design, but he does bring some intimidation factor, and I found it quite funny, the standoff that the farmer has in his tractor against Fred in the mystery machine towards the end of the episode. Fair play to Fred though, he gets the better of him quite easily. Don't bring a tractor to a van fight, I guess. Like a lot of these monsters, there's enough about him and enough things which go on in the episode to make him good overall. I think that says probably more about the show being good, rather than any of these monsters being amazing by themselves, necessarily. Next up is the Frozen Fiend, from Diamonds Are a Ghoul's Best Friend. And it's the godly monster, I think. He's this ice hockey playing fiend. Supposedly it was this old hockey player who lost in a tournament, but in actuality, the villain was the famous Russian figure skater Yelena, who was actually trying to smuggle diamonds under the ice. It was actually a well thought out plan, unlike most of these, and the villain had a unique design. The episode is one of the more memorable ones from the series, so yeah, I really like him, I have to say. More than I thought I would going into that particular episode. Next up is, well, I think another one for godly. The menacing metallic clown from A Terrifying Round, with a menacing metallic clown. I quite like the episode, at this crazy golf course, and Shaggy has to be the one to kind of compete. It's cool to see Shaggy be the one to actually have a bit of a backbone in this episode, especially against a fearsome monster like this, who is literally seen eating people throughout the course of the episode. I mean, look at his design. Clowns are creepy enough for a lot of people as is, so seeing this thing bearing down on you, yeah, you're gonna have a bad time. Definitely a memorable thing from this series. Next up is the Toxic Terror, from the camp episode. I'm not even gonna try and pronounce the name. I don't think he's quite godly, but he's top of good. He's got a good appearance, being this plant monster that's supposedly oozing this harmful material, being made out of a toxic waste dump. It's an interesting episode. I mainly like the monster for his design. The culprits were again two kids who didn't want the camp to be turned into an adult resort. And once they found out, the adults sided with the kids and scared the camp director away. So the kids got their way in the end. I mean, that is what it is, but I'm ranking the monsters more so than the episode, and I like him as a monster. Next up was, well, just a dragon from the Hong Kong episode, and he does nothing for me. He might even be trash, you know. Top of trash. Like that's the compliment. I mean, it's a very colourful dragon, as a lot of Asian dragons are depicted in mythology. But again, it's another big monster, big machine, that doesn't do anything for me. I wasn't that invested in the plotline of the episode, about stealing this $1 million ring. It's just kind of bland, isn't it? Bland as bland could be. If you like these big mechanical monsters, you'll probably rate a lot of these different to me. But to me, more often than not, in general, the snow creature being an exception, they end up being lackluster. Next up is the skeleton driver, who, like a few of the monsters on this list, like the cat creature and the owl bird, is a rip-off of a monster from the Scooby Doo show, but he's better than the other rip-offs, I think. He's arguably better than the Scooby Doo show version of him. I think the episode is slightly more action-filled here than it was in the Scooby Doo show. His design is simple but okay, gets the job done. Again, it's a good episode, there's a lot that goes on. Again, the culprits are two kids who want to spoil the race because they're too young to compete in it themselves, but it all works out in the end. Yeah, it's just slightly above average, I'd say, for the show. Next up is the episode Gold Poor, and with that of course the Gold Monster. I'm gonna put him in Godly, I think. His design is a bit unique. He supposedly has the power to turn people into like gold statues, which is scary and interesting. The episode has an interesting vibe to it, where they're all at Fort Knox, and the villain ends up being one of the drill sergeants. And again, his plan involved the Secret Six puppies. He wanted to use them to dig out of the facility. It's a good episode, the story's okay. He certainly provides a presence in the episode. So yeah, why not stick another one in Godly? Next up is a coral creature from Reef Grief. I'll put him in good. I think he's got an interesting design. It wasn't actually hostile by default, which was interesting, but it was building a tunnel through the Great Barrier Reef. It was supposedly like a real thing as well. Not technically a monster, but it apparently evolved from coral, which was interesting. The episode was okay, probably above average, so yeah, it's good. And finally we have the episode E-Scream and the Osmonds, who are these little creatures. And some people probably like them, but to me they're just okay. They're from a video game, created by the Doctor in the episode, but they somehow turned evil. I mean, supposedly the gimmick of them was that they had sharp teeth, apparently enough to bite through metal, and they could deceive people by looking cute, while at the same time turning evil on them. I still don't find them that intimidating though. I think they could have done more with the episode than they actually did. Again, I'm sure there's some people who love them, but like all of this, it's all based on my personal opinion, and they just didn't do a lot for me. I just don't think they're all that. So that's all of the 42 different sets of monsters and villains ranked. And again, it's a similar kind of dispersion to the Scooby Doo show. But as you can see, there's definitely more good monsters and bad ones, which is to the show's credit. A lot of these episodes were interesting, and a lot of the monsters kind of played into the episode. The stories intertwined in a better way than a lot of the Scooby Doo shows. So although I wouldn't say that What's New Scooby Doo has the most creative set of monsters overall, it has some of the more interesting ones, which tie into the environment in a more effective way than most Scooby Doo shows. I think that's how I would sum it up. So yeah, that's my take on the What's New villains. Please leave your thoughts on this show in the comments. As ever, I would be glad to read them. I may do some more Scooby Doo tier lists in the future, but I do have more content on the channel outside of Scooby Doo, which I have lined up, so no promises on when. For now though, thanks for watching, and as always, take care.